Oh, shoot.
Hi, Joanne.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Just hoping everything goes smoothly.
You know,
I was
we're
able
going to do the
to.
best we can. Yeah, we're going to do the best we can. There's always something that happens. Hi, Joan. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Good. I'm actually going to potentially call so that I have two separate, channels so that if like Wi-Fi goes crazy, I'm still on the phone or whatever. I'm going to try to do that. But
Oh, that's a good idea. I've never.
yeah, we'll
Yeah.
see. Let's
Will
see.
there be an echo if we do that?
It won't. It won't. It'll know that I'm the same person. So.
Ah, interesting. And I've never done that. So do you recommend that?
You know, I've had an issue where, hang on just a second.
Okay.
I've had a situation where my Wi-Fi router decided to restart in the middle of a webinar.
So hello, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joanne Dimitrakopoulos, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. I'm also a board member of SAMPS, a not-for-profit organization focused on advancing the skill sets of commercial professionals in the life science industry. SAMPS has been holding annual meetings since 2013. However, under the current circumstances, we thought it would be beneficial to transition content into a monthly webinar and hold virtual networking events. As mentioned earlier, I will be recording this session so that we can share it with our members at a later date. Please be sure to go to our website and become a member of SAMPS. For our inaugural webinar, we thought that you would be interested in learning about the state of the market due to the pandemic. We hope that this is going to be an interactive session, so please go ahead and enter your questions in either the Q&A feature or chat function of Zoom, and we will answer them at the appropriate time. I'd like to go ahead right now and introduce our panelists. Bill Kelly is president and co-founder of Bioinformatics Incorporated. He has been conducting market research for approximately 25 years on support for market entry, strategic positioning, and product launches. He's joined by Joan Boyce, who is also a board member of SAMPS and serves as a trustee with the University of Florida Whitney Laboratory for Marine Bioscience. For her day job, she is the VP and General Manager of BioCompare. She's joined by Mike Okimoto, co-founder of Compare Networks, the parent company of BioCompare. He is responsible for the editorial and data content for the Compare Network verticals, in addition to the business model strategy and evolution. Finally, I would like to introduce Hamid Ghanadan, founder of and CEO of Linus, a strategy and innovation firm focused in the life science and healthcare industry. He is also author of 2 books, Persuading Scientists and Catalytic Experiences. I have both of them right here and have read both. He is also a contributing voice, well done, a contributing voice on the Forbes Agency Council. I'd like to thank our esteemed panel for joining us today, and I'll now hand over the center camera to Bill, and I will be advancing the slides for you, Bill.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us to find out a little bit more from our tracking survey on how COVID-19 is impacting survey research. My name is Bill Kelly, and as Joanne said, I'm with Bioinformatics, which is part of Science and Medicine Group, an integrated market information and media firm focusing on the life sciences, analytical instrumentation, clinical diagnostics, and medical imaging. As a matter of fact, not just yet, John. Well, it doesn't really matter. In fact, we'll be presenting the outlook for analytical instrumentation industry tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, if you want to send me an email to join that. Since March 26th, we have been surveying scientists from around the world to understand the impact of COVID-19 on their research activities. Each Friday, we field a 14-question survey to members of our online community, the Science Advisory Board. The Science Advisory Board consists of tens of thousands of researchers engaged in life science basic research, translational, and drug discovery. And they have agreed to participate in our research focus groups and interviews and are the core element of the data that we're about to present. Next slide, please. Back in March, when the national emergency was first declared in the US, fully 87% of all life science labs worldwide were closed. As you can see, this has now dropped to just 18%, with most of those that remain closed being located in North America and South America. Most labs are operating at a reduced operational capacity, likely as a result of institutional mandates to limit the number of personnel in the lab at any given time. Next slide. There we go. As countries began to partially open up their economies, we observed a steady increase in the number of labs coming back online. From the beginning of our tracker, a higher percent of labs in the pharma and biotech sectors remained open or reported that they were operating at a reduced capacity. This was quite different from the academic sector, where there was a near total shutdown in the beginning and a slower return to normal operations. Next slide. So we asked our respondents to tell us which lab activities were most affected by their organization's response to the pandemic. In this chart, we compare their responses in the first 2 months of our survey as opposed to the most recent 2 months. As more labs open up, you can see that the inability to conduct planned experiments has decreased as more and more scientists get back into their labs and resume their research, which makes a lot of sense. What's a bit more concerning is the rise in scientists reporting that hiring has slowed or been halted and their inability to explore new directions in their research. Pursuing a new direction often entails hiring new staff, securing new funding, and buying new equipment. These trends reflect the uncertainty of the times, which of course extends outside the lab to their personal lives as well. Next slide. At the beginning, only 39% of our respondents reported that they were seeing their organizations implement budget reductions. But in the last 2 months, we've seen that rise to 58%. We also see a rise in the number of institutions implementing hiring freezes. Our sense is that this is due to a cautionary approach to the uncertain future, rather than an actual reduction in budget for funding for this fiscal year. Next slide. This is sort of a good news, bad news side. The bad news is that scientists across the board anticipate a decrease in spending on lab products over the next 3 months, especially in instrumentation. The good news is that when you see their predictions earlier in the pandemic, their anticipated cuts in spending were far more dire than they actually have turned out to be. Again, this makes sense to me. When this hit us earlier in the year, none of us knew what to expect, and that includes your scientific customers. As the situation has stabilized, at least in most places, things look better than was initially feared. and this extends to the products that drive life science research. You can now view regular updates to a partial data set on our website, updated weekly at bioinfoinc.com. I'd like to now turn it over to my friend Joan Boyce for a different perception on how scientists are reacting and particularly how it impacts their purchasing of laboratory products.
Thank you, Bill. And it looks like we have a poll here. Joanne, I believe that you had put together a poll for our participants to take. And before I begin my presentation, why don't we all take a few moments and take the poll.
Okay, I am just launching the poll now.
Okay, great. Excellent. Looks like we wanted to get a sense of the impact of COVID-19 and how it impacted your sales. So yeah, it'll take a few minutes.
Yeah, let's just give
That'd be
a
great.
couple more minutes, or seconds, I should say.
While the participants are answering, I wanted to address something, Bill, that you had mentioned in your data. I agree with you that there was the perception at the very beginning of the pandemic was, one of shock. And, we also saw it in our data that people were expecting a lot more dire outcome earlier on as things were very uncertain. And what's interesting is that what we're also seeing in our data is similar, that people are now starting to basically go back to trying to figure out how productivity is going to happen irrespective of what's going on with the pandemic. So we're, that shift, you're right, is that there's a kind of a good news, bad news. Being down is bad, but not nearly as bad as what we had thought.
That's right. Starting to adjust to the new normal.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's a good point, Hamid. Oh, go on, Joanne.
So can everybody see the results of the poll? Great. So it definitely looks like although sales declined, they are recovering, and some have even been doing better since the pandemic. So thanks for sharing your opinions. And I know a couple of people have requested information about the slides to see whether the slides will be available after the presentation. I'll leave that up to the presenters if they'd like me to share the deck, but we are recording this session, so you will get to see that. There we go.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks everyone. And thank you, Joanne. Thanks, Sams, for hosting this webinar. Again, I'm Joan Boyce. I'm the VP and General Manager of BioCompare. For those of you who are not familiar with BioCompare, BioCompare is a marketplace that lists 7 million products from over 400 suppliers, and it's been around for 20 years. And so what we decided to do, next slide, is to put a survey on our homepage. And that survey was started March 24th, and it ran through July 8th. And we had a total of 6,600 respondents that said that they were actively involved in life science research during this time. And for the purposes of this survey, we took the data and we broke it out into 3 periods. The first period is, as you can see here, is March 24th to April 30th. And the second period is May, the month of May. The third period is June 1st through July 8th. And we all had really healthy respondent numbers during each of the periods. And again, this was on our homepage, and I think it's really important to note early on that the BioCompare visitor, typical visitor, comes to BioCompare to really learn about products, to decide upon products. And so when we take a look at this data, we need to keep that in mind. Whereas Bill's data, his poll, his aggregate set was a broader audience, and where the BioCompare audience is a subset of perhaps the audience that Bill surveyed and answered those questions. And so the results are slightly different, but not too different. So next slide, please. So the main questions that we asked in the survey, again, like Bill, we asked to describe the current status of your lab or workplace. But for the focus of the presentation that I'll be giving, we're really gonna focus on whether or not the respondents were engaged in COVID research. And then we're going to take the answers to the other questions. Example, are they still ordering products? The types of products they've ordered in the past 2 weeks? What region are they in? And their institution type. And we're going to do some crosstab so that we can really dive deeper into some of these results. And so the next slide, please. Excellent. So in this particular slide, I thought we would just compare what we're seeing with regards to lab status to what Bill is seeing. And what you can see here across 3 periods, we had slightly higher numbers as far as people operating normally. It's 40% in the first period, 47% in the second period, and really happy to report in the third period, 69% are saying that their lab or office is open and they're able to return back to work normally. So next slide, please. What we also wanted to determine was what percentage of our audience was actually doing SARS-CoV-2 research. And what we see across the 3 periods is that it is about a third, with the third period being slightly lower. And we weren't too surprised about that. As more labs were opening up, we were finding that it's kind of diluting those researchers that are doing COVID research versus not. So let's keep this in mind when we take a look at all the other data, because like I said earlier, we're going to be doing a lot of the cross-tabbing. So the next slide, what we wanted to show was essentially the status of their lab and if there was any correlation or differences as to whether or not they were actually engaged in COVID research. So what you can see here is that in the first period, we see a pretty wide gap, about 18% difference. Those that were engaged in COVID research had more of their labs open. And some of the information that we've learned and have some of our end users have shared with us and our colleagues that are in the lab is that those scientists that were doing COVID research were deemed to be essential and probably were able to get into their lab a little bit earlier than their non-COVID counterparts or COVID research counterparts. So you can see across the 3 periods that the gap is narrowing in terms of whether or not they're involved in COVID research and the status of their lab. In period 3 was 70% no, 77% yes. So the gap was narrowing. Next slide, please. What we wanted to then ask and what we wanted to learn was if the people that are coming to the site were still ordering products. So what you see here, the data that we're showing now, is essentially for across whether they were doing COVID research or not. This is just an aggregate. The response for the first period was that 74% were actually still ordering products. And again, we have to keep in mind the context and the fact that people do come to BioCompare when they are actively searching for products. And so that number was actually surprisingly high. We were pleasantly surprised to see that when we did the survey. And we're actually even really glad to report that in period 3, 91% of the respondents said that they are ordering products. And this is an animation, so if you just click on to the next data point, we then took a look at, one more click, Joanne, thanks, because there's just the end number, yeah. So what we then did was take a look at this data and broke it down as to whether or not they're engaged in COVID research or not. So those that were, 88% said they were still ordering products, where those that were not, 76%. So I thought that was interesting to share as well. And you can see that their overall respondents that were doing COVID research was about 1,000 versus the 2,000. So even that said, people that weren't doing COVID research were still ordering products. So the next slide, please.
Sorry, I think there is a question that might be appropriate.
Okay, sure. Let's go for it.
Okay, I think from Robin Turner, the question is, how has sales been impacted? They answered no impact, but was not asked what was the impact on delivery of bookings and impact on cash.
Oh, product delivery?
Yes.
Yeah, we asked that question early on in the survey, believe it or not, and the impact for the first month was negligible. So the survey was quite long, so we actually took that question away. But happy to share the full results with all the participants. There's about, I don't know, 30 or 40 slides. Happy to share them all with the participants after the fact. But that's from the data that we can glean. I don't know if Hamid or Bill want to chime in on any observations they may have seen with the research they've done.
Yeah, so with our research, actually, we addressed that question qualitatively. And what we found out is that there's, this whole idea of open versus closed is also kind of a spectrum. Mm-hmm. And it really, especially in academia, but in other parts of science, like while the access to the bench may have been severely limited and is becoming less and less limited, science hasn't stopped. And so we actually had information from researchers, academics, who said that they actually asked their suppliers to send products to their home because shipping and receiving was closed at their university because they had cell cultures to feed, and then they would essentially go into the lab in order to just maintain things and keep things running so that they wouldn't have to start completely over again with a lot of the longitudinal studies. So there's blurriness in every which way that you look at this, and a lot of our collective respondents are getting things done to the best that they can. So that's what I would share here. But I think your point, Robin, is a good one. Is that every business has multiple ways of addressing, their revenue. There's revenues, there's bookings, there's delivery, there's cash flow, and all of those things have just been, they're not synchronous right now because of everything that's happening, and we hear that a lot from our clients as well.
Great,
Thanks,
thank you. I think hopefully, Carrie, that has answered your question. She had put something in the chat around whether labs were still open for operations during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think her question was around automation. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say anecdotally that we have found that the larger the lab and the larger the organization, the more formalized were their continuity of operations plans.
Right.
They were best prepared to at least access data remotely, to communicate with each other remotely. The only thing that was happening or not happening was work at the bench. And similarly, if you look at institutions' websites, they have a lot of clear guidance on how labs are to reopen, and it has all of the regulations that you would expect in terms of limiting personnel, hand washing stations, those type of things. But what's different about our market, of course, is all of our scientific colleagues are very well trained in PPE. They have the PPE. They know how to maintain a sanitized atmosphere. So that gives them somewhat of a leg up over the rest of the populace.
Yeah, we've heard is maybe the biggest shift is just the staggering, right? So where the lab, I think really what's been most difficult from what we've heard is the collaboration efforts. And certainly when you're in the lab, because they're staggering who can come in just to keep that social distance, that seemed to be a challenge for some of the scientists that we talked to. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, Joanne, should I proceed?
Yes, please.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so what we did with this data set here is we wanted to find out, this data is representing those who said that they are ordering products and whether or not they're engaged in COVID research. And what you can see in period one was that there was a great number of those that were doing COVID research and were ordering products. And again, like their lab status, the gap was narrowing over time in period three. So that we thought that was some interesting data to share as well. So the next slide. Again, along the same lines of them still ordering or answering yes to ordering products. The top bar where it says grand total, that shows the percentage that were ordering products, those that were doing COVID research, those that were not. So those that were was 36%, those that were not was 64%. But we thought it would be really interesting to compare the data based on place of employment. And this is actually throughout the survey, something that I found really surprising was the difference in the pharmaceutical sector. Because you think with all the vaccine development, the fact that those that were ordering products, only 17% in pharma, and it was significantly less than their biotech counterparts or government counterparts. Only 17% in pharma were actually, those that were purchasing were actually involved in COVID research. So we thought that that was really interesting. The ones that were purchasing the most, no surprise there, it was in contract research labs and diagnostic labs. So I was just really surprised about that. And I was wondering, Bill or Hamid, if you're equally surprised in looking at this data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I agree with you. I think, you know, again, from our perspective, sorry, Bill, the pharma companies, we've heard it, you know, in two different ways. You know, same thing is that there's a whole slew of pharma companies that were essential businesses that kept going. You know, I have a colleague who works at one of the biopharma companies who's been in the news as far as being on the forefront of the vaccine development. And he said he hasn't really been home to have dinner with his family for like 3 months, you know, because they're just working around the clock, but they are at reduced personnel. And so, you know, and so how might they be, you know, dealing with things? Also, pharma has different sort of periodicity for supply chain management. And so they may actually be working down their supply as well. And so that there may be other channels that they're receiving, you know, receiving their lab needs that are not a purchasing or ordering perspective. They may be coming through other channels. So
interesting. Yeah. Bill, did you have anything to add?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, when you consider 6 months ago, there were no COVID-19.
I know, exactly.
These are very large percentages of your visitors.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we're going to see that further evidenced in some other slides that I'm going to show around our site data and product page views to our directory. So yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting perspective and slice of the data. And then the final slide that I'm going to share with the data actually has to do, and it kind of dovetails a little bit with the last slide, Bill, that you presented, but this slide is, we asked the question for those that were purchasing, what products are you ordering within the past 2 weeks? And this was across all time periods. And then we broke it down as to whether or not they were doing COVID research or not. And what we saw was that the product areas that kind of mapped out or were part of either the COVID research or diagnostic or testing workflow definitely saw greater purchasing than those for those people who were not doing COVID research. So things like equipment, right? PCR as a workhorse, you know, workstations, automated workstations, lab consumables to support that workflow, kits and assays, and chemicals and biochemicals. So we thought that that was really interesting as well, that there were more of those types of products being ordered by the people doing COVID research versus not. And Bill, I don't know if you sliced and diced your kind of product data. I was very intrigued by your slide. I actually want to study it a little bit more after the presentation. Yeah. But I was wondering if there was any other data that you had to support this.
We only asked generally about, are you engaged in infectious disease research?
Okay.
I can certainly look that up and share it with SAMPS.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Go back. But again, remember, our question was worded, or it was, what do you anticipate your spend to be in these categories over the next 30 days, as opposed to what are you spending today?
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent.
And I think there's another question that came in asking about the demographics as well. So is this global data, or have you also looked at it regionally?
Yes, so this we can slice it and dice it. I'm happy to do that. The survey respondents here were 35% North America. I'm cheating here. 30% Europe, 24% Asia, and 4% South America, and the rest was rest of world. So it was definitely a global participation.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Excellent. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about our traffic. And as I mentioned earlier, BioCompare has 3.3 million scientists coming annually. The majority of them come to our product directory. And so we thought we kind of view our product directory traffic as a proxy to purchasing, because that's typically what happens, it precedes purchasing, because we know that a lot of the visitors that come go on to purchase products after doing the research on our site. So we thought it would be really interesting to share data on our directory visits. And so what you see on this slide is the traffic, the visits globally to our product directory starting in the middle of March. And so the blue bars represent the traffic for the current year, this year. And the green line at the top, what we're doing is we're comparing traffic of the same time period last year as a proxy. So you can see early on in the pandemic, our directory definitely took a hit to traffic, which is understandable. Labs were closed down, not as many people were working. There's going to be less traffic to the product directory. But what we're really happy to report is that it's recovered since June, and it's about at 100% versus where we were June last year. So we're really encouraged by this data. And then the next 3 slides will kind of break it out regionally, because there are differences. So the next slide, you can see the US. And what we're seeing in the US is that there was a huge gap huge downturn in terms of traffic and visits to the directory. And the recovery is slower. The recovery is about at 89%. There is a recovery, but it's not as fast as some of the other regions in the world. The leader in recovery with regards to directory visits is Europe, and that's demonstrated and reflected on the next slide. You can see in Europe, again, early on, huge deficit, but we have fully recovered year over year in June. So we're very happy to report that for Europe with our directory traffic. And then the next slide shows Asia. For Asia is kind of second in the recovery in terms of regionally. And one country actually in Asia that's really leading the way is Japan. We're seeing a full recovery in Japan, and other countries are actually seeing a recovery to the tune of about 95% to where the traffic levels were in June last time, this period. So I thought this was really interesting information, wanted to share it with you all. I don't know if that dovetails with the audience, what they were seeing with their sales or slowdowns. Certainly if there are any further data points, we're happy to share them. You can email us or get in touch or ask a question. But that's the data with regards to the directory visits. Now, we also support the directory with a lot of editorial content. And so this next slide, we thought it would be really interesting. It's like, okay, so we saw a downward trend in our directory traffic. What was going on with our editorial traffic? In this slide, again, the lines, the vertical lines represent this current year. The green line represents last year. We've made some heavy investments in editorial. So this data point actually shows we're looking into the fall, because we have seen year over year really a lot of growth in our editorial traffic. But what's really apparent, if you kind of look towards the right, I know it's really small, but in the sort of March, April timeframe, we saw huge spikes in our editorial page views to the tune of 268% increase. And that makes sense, right? So people were spending more time planning, they were reading, our news was getting more activity. So the offset we saw, the declines that we saw in our directory traffic were kind of offset by some of the increases that we saw in the editorial page views. And there were no surprises there. That makes perfect sense. So that's some of the trends that I wanted to share with regards to our traffic. And the next few slides, as I round up my presentation, actually will then focus on product categories. So these are product page view trends. Just to define a product page view, that's when someone comes onto BioCompare and they're interested in learning about a specific product from a specific supplier, they can click on that and view the product specifications. So that's how we define a product page view. And so what we're doing here is comparing the fall time frame. Sort of that's our baseline, the fall. And then we're comparing it to, this year. And so we threw in the fall so you can see the huge spikes in certain product categories, such as thermocyclers. That happened around mid-March. And so it was both real time and just thermocyclers. We saw a huge spike, again, a decline, but still very healthy growth over the fall for that particular product category. The next slide takes a look at hoods. So whether they're biological safety cabinets, laminar flow hoods, or PCR hoods, we did see a huge increase in biological safety cabinets and also somewhat in PCR hoods as well. So I thought that was interesting and wanted to share. And you can see it's around the same time frame as the thermocyclers. The next slide actually shows, if we kind of further go down into the workflow for COVID research and testing, what we saw huge increases is in both automated DNA, RNA purification sample workstations and viral RNA purification kits. Again, this is all part of that workflow, preparing samples, getting them ready to do PCR. And so again, very healthy growth. It has declined a bit, but still very healthy growth over the fall. And then the next data point actually looks at both, I'm sorry, Joanne, if you can advance the next slide, that would be great, PCR kits. So we are then seeing PCR kits, seeing a huge increase a little bit after the increases we were seeing in the sample prep and in the instruments themselves. And that kind of makes sense because that's the part of the workflow. You have to get the sample and then you can do PCR. So again, very, very healthy increase. And then the last slide that I'm going to be presenting actually shows a comparison of coronavirus ELISA kits and antibody products. And we see out of all the products, like spikes even earlier on in sort of the end of January, beginning of February timeframe, huge peaks mid-March into April. And as you can see in the fall, we virtually had no traffic or no page views for those products, very few. And again, it's really sharpened off, but we're still seeing healthy increases over the fall. So thank you. That's all I have for my presentation. I hope you learned something from it and can take away some key points. And at this time, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Hamid.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions.
Okay, sure.
I think one of them, there is a question about how many people participated in the BioCompare survey.
Okay, yeah. So the respondents between the time periods was 6,600. And earlier in the slides, I actually gave the respondent numbers for each time period. And they were in between, I think, like 2,600 and 1,500. So it's a very big sample size.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
I think there's another question as well around funding. Do we anticipate funding cuts, grant cuts? Has anybody looked into that?
I have data on that. I have some information on that. I don't have a slide on it, but when we asked this question, very much to what Bill showed, where there was an anticipation of like very much doom and gloom at the beginning, our respondents anticipated major funding cuts. But as the time period has gone on, that has become basically a normal distribution curve, where essentially just as many people are saying that they're anticipating funding increases as they're anticipating funding cuts. We actually asked our respondents to type in sort of, hand write in what they do. And so somebody could say, I look at, genomics or whatever, and somebody else can say something else. And so we actually have a 2D graph of who's expecting funding cuts versus funding increases based on what they do. And it's really across the board. I would actually say that, folks that are looking at complex and rare disease models like cancer, they're kind of all over the place with the largest being that there's no impact. and then infectious diseases seeing some, anticipating an increase. These are all self-reported though, and we have to take into consideration that that at least in the United States, the House committee just approved a $5.8 billion funding increase to the NIH, and it's not just all for infectious research, disease research either. And so that should be taken into consideration as that goes into the, into the funding cycle coming up.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, we also heard that there were sort of COVID-specific grants that were available, and we know some researchers that have applied that were sort of like cancer researchers were applied, and actually, did get the grant, and it enabled them to actually get back to the lab earlier, and they were kind of straddling both sides. So there was some money. I don't have data to support how much, but there was some money opening up for COVID-specific grants. And one of the questions that we asked in the survey that I didn't actually share, we asked if there was an anticipation in shifting the focus of your research to SARS-CoV-2. And what we saw in the earlier periods was about 35% of the respondents said yes. And then if we took a look around the May-June timeframe, that kind of dwindled down to about 15 to 12%. So hopefully that's, and it's probably for reasons, whether they're in pharma or going after some of those grants. But it could be interesting to explore, how much funding there actually was during that period for new grants for SARS-CoV-2 research.
That's all published, at least for US data, that's all published at the NIAID website. What you're brought up about cancer researchers, I've noticed that people that were studying immune response prior to COVID-19 are certainly getting a lot of grant money.
Absolutely. Yeah, immunotherapy, absolutely, we're seeing the same.
Also, I mean, even secondary effects of like cytokine storms as a result of cell therapy, that, one of the major issues with the, people who fall sick of COVID-19 is a cytokine storm. And so, people who are looking at that in the cell therapy world are also moving over. So, this idea of essentially expanding, I mean, obviously, if you're an evolutionary biologist, studying, how neurons get built, there's going to be a harder way for those researchers to find a way of making an impact. But we are seeing the same thing, is that people are trying to figure out how they can contribute and make an impact to understanding and fighting COVID-19. Excellent. I guess I'll dive in now and talk about why I'm here. So as Bill and Joan and Mike also, shared a phenomenal amount of data about what's happening, we also took some data starting on, early March, actually, as things were starting to shut down. But our intention for taking the data was a little bit different in that we wanted to find out on behalf of the industry what's going to happen, because a lot of our clients were asking us, how should I prepare? And so, we received three kinds of questions. One was a group of companies that were trying to survive. Essentially, how long is this going to last, and how can I make it? And, again, both Bill and Joan's data really hopefully help and shed light on, the anticipated funding cuts, the shifts in the market, so that you can actually focus on what's happening. The second set of questions that we received were, along the lines of, how can I actually prepare for the transition? So let's say you had a product that you were going to launch at AACR, and all of a sudden AACR is gone. And now you're at a point where, are there even going to be conferences in the future, and what are they going to look like? And so, how do you prepare for a product launch in that kind of, how do you basically reshift your current? And then there's a few clients that came and said, we want to shape the future. How do we shape the future? And then how do we actually change and drive this? So what we ended up doing is develop a model that you're seeing on screen here about the different phases that this entire pandemic was going to take. And we first published this on the 17th of March, and we've iterated it since. What you're seeing now is our June 2nd iteration, which was the last iteration that we provided. And so essentially what we did was we looked at each phase of this disruption from the perspective of behavior and how people are going to behave, because each of these phases has very specific behavioral aspects to it. So as you saw in the data, and of course this is looking backwards now, but at the time, there was an initial shock. Bill's data showed it, Joan's data showed it, and there was an initial shock where everyone was just, you know, number one, they were worried about their own personal safety and the safety of their loved ones and their lab mates. And so productivity essentially just came to a halt. And there was a massive dip in the amount of work that people were doing. Labs were shutting down. You know, people were basically taking their PPE from the labs home so that they could go grocery shopping. And so that was the mentality of the industry. But then once, you know, things calmed down from that initial fervor, is a time period which we call the golden interim. And people sort of look at us cross-eyed when we talk about this golden interim time. Why is it golden? And what is so golden about this time? So again, like we mentioned, science doesn't stop even though there's no access to the bench to do wet lab and wet chemistry. And the reason why this period of time was golden was twofold. Number one, scientists, you know, for the first time had a chance to step back and to catch up and to look at other aspects of research, to read papers, to submit manuscripts, to analyze data, to collaborate in an unprecedented way, to really take a thoughtful approach to their research, to make strategic decisions for how they were going to change their research questions or their research techniques once they go back to the lab. And so that's the reason why it was golden. And it was golden for this audience because if you are thinking about, you know, if you, for example, would like to change a standard procedure or you want your product to be considered in the future, this, even though they're not buying today, even though they're not issuing you a, you know, big fat check or a purchase order, they're absolutely in the mode of making decisions about how they might change their future. And so that's the golden period. And then this quasi-normalcy, this bubble that was happening. That period is now over, and we're now in a period which we're calling the rapid. If any of you have ever gone whitewater rafting or kayaking, you'll know the feeling that I'm talking about, where the force of the water pushing you downstream is just awesome, and you can't really fight it, or all you can do is just maintain a controlled line down river and get there safely. But there's so much turbulence happening all around you that you're not in the mode of knowing what's really going on. You're just looking at the next step in front of you or the next drop that's in front of you. And that's exactly what we're seeing now, unfortunately. These rapids are due to the lack of clarity and to Bill's point, the lack of potentially sort of top-down decisions about how to work, especially in sectors like academia, where there's a lot more autonomy from lab to lab. One of the downsides of that is no one knows what's going on. And again, in our qualitative research, we talk to a lot of academicians who are saying, you know, gosh, I just really wish there was some sort of a guidelines, like, you know, the CDC's guidelines is just sort of vague and I don't know what to do. Is it safe for my students to come back? Should I ask? You know, all of those are adding to the turbulence. But once that turbulence was over, we saw that there was going to be a massive influx once the transition back to the lab happened. I just want to clarify that even though labs are opening, this massive surge transition hasn't quite happened yet. And you know, I think people are still in that rapids mode right now and just kind of bumping around through the turbulence. And that turbulence isn't going to stop. I mean, you see the jaggedy edges in the curve, but there is going to be some point where the researchers are going to try to make up for lost time and lost productivity. And so there is going to be a spike in activity. Now that activity may translate into different ways for you. It may actually turn into them buying products. And it may be products, I saw a question in the chat box that I'd like to address now is, you know, labs may choose to personalize what was essentially communal products. For example, pipettes. Back before COVID, I didn't like people touching my pipettes to begin with. We heard a lot anecdotally where researchers would lock pipettes into a drawer so that other people wouldn't touch them. Now that may actually become part of the part of the regular modality, and so there may be a spike there. Now the other part, and we actually have data on this, in the golden interim, if they've made decisions about major innovations that they were going to implement into their research, they may implement it into this transition period. But if your product requires somebody to think strategically about their research, the transition period isn't going to be a time where they're actually they're reactive, right? They're getting their stuff up and running. So if it's consumables or everyday lab products, absolutely, I think you're going to see a surge in economic activity to make up for lost time. If there's something strategic, they've either already decided for it or against it during the golden interim. And I think you'd be better off waiting until the big fervor is over and things go back to the next normal. Then that is the period of what we're calling the next normal. And I just want to in 30 seconds clarify, no one's going back to normal. Back to normal is a state that doesn't exist anymore. We've sort of left that shore and we're not swimming back to it because because the landscape is different. Obviously, we're seeing that the coronavirus isn't going away as rapidly as we had wished. And so the next normal is absolutely something that we're striving toward. Also, from a commercial landscape, there will be winners and losers, and there's going to be a change in how we are able to communicate with our audiences and our customers. Going and visiting a customer in their lab or the office is a thing of the past. And so a lot of our clients are asking, okay, how do we innovate on the commercial front to be able to serve and create and maintain relationships with our customers? All of those in total are going to wrap into, and there's a call to action, I think, for our industry is to say, okay, collectively, can we bring some vision to what the next normal looks like, or can we actually drive it and lead it rather than, having the scientists tell us whether we can go visit them or not in hopes that, we can resume the same kind of sales modalities that we had in the past. So I think there's a big opportunity for us to innovate here as well as we go into the next normal.
Yeah. So thanks, Hamid. I know a question did come in, and I think you probably have already addressed it, that we exit your graph at a higher rate than we started at.
Yeah.
And is this because we're rushing to try and catch up with research that was halted?
Yeah, no, actually, the rushing to catch up is actually going to be somewhat of a feeble attempt to cover that the reduction in productivity in the golden interim. So sorry for the noise outside, but there's absolutely people are trying to catch up. We had a researcher actually tell us for every month that I'm out of the lab, it's going to take me 2 to 3 months to roll back up. However, I think the reason for the productivity change on an ongoing basis is going to be because of the changes that are going to be made to the labs or changes that labs are going to make to themselves. So one of the questions that we asked are, what are the things that you're going to do once things go back, get to a state of normalcy? And overwhelmingly, a lot of our respondents said that they're looking to implementing digitization, remote access, and automation into their labs. And these are even in academia, they're looking into these kinds of technologies. So what's going to happen there is you're going to have labs, the lights off lab where samples are being run 24/7. You're going to have ability to share data across borders and across geographies and have different kinds of collaboration. There's going to be somewhat of an industrialization of science that a lot of times what ends up happening in the long term, whenever there's a shock to any system, is an industrialization, right? Big money comes in, big infrastructure changes happen, and then you're going to have this. And that's why we're going to see that difference, is that net, when this whole thing is into that sort of business, when the next normal becomes business as usual, you're going to start to see productivity at a higher level.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I know that we're running short on time here, but we will be responding to your questions that we haven't got to during this webinar. Again, thank you to the panelists. I'd just like to let everybody know about our next webinar, which will be on August the 26th again at 9 a.m. and the goal is to sort of run around 40 minutes so that we're not taking too much of your time. We are going to be talking about the way that COVID-19 has changed the way you conduct business. We will be on our panel have Hrisi Samarthio from Thermo Fisher Scientific, Andy Batera of New England Biolabs, and David Weber of Maravai Life Sciences. And they will be discussing how business has changed due to COVID. So again, thank you very much. Please do go to the website and register to become a member of SAMPS. It is free, and we will be following up with information and whether you can have a copy of the slides. That will be down to the panelists today.
Yeah, just for everybody to know, I'm totally okay with my one slide.
And I'll be setting them up as well. Thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for having me and Linus as part of this presentation. It was really fun. Learned a lot. Take care, everyone.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.